From darkness to justice, the Dayton Leroy Rogers saga. Welcome to The Most Evil, where we delve into the minds of history's most notorious serial killers. In today's episode, we explore the chilling case of Dayton Leroy Rogers, also known as the Mollala Forest Killer. Discover the haunting details of Rogers' crimes and explore how his actions affected the community of Oregon. Early in his life, Dayton Leroy Rogers experienced hardship and instability. Rogers grew up in a troubled family in Moscow, Idaho, on September 30th, 1953. Growing up in a dysfunctional family, he suffered neglect, abuse, and violence, laying the foundation for his later darkness. Growing up in poverty, Rogers faced numerous challenges and lacked the stability and support that every child deserves. His tumultuous home life contributed to feelings of alienation and despair, leading him down a path of rebellion and delinquency. In his teenage years, Rogers struggled to find a sense of purpose and belonging as he battled the scars of his troubled past. As a result of his troubled upbringing, Rogers initially tried to lead a conventional life, working odd jobs and building a future for himself. In spite of his attempts, he was prevented from achieving his goals by a series of setbacks and personal failures, driving him further into despair. In addition to Rogers' disillusionment, his inner turmoil fueled a growing sense of anger and resentment towards society. In the late 1980s, when he could no longer cope with the pain and trauma of his past, he spiraled into an insidious world of violence and depravity that culminated in his horrific crimes in the Mollala Forest of Oregon. From 1987 to 1989, Dayton Leroy Rogers carried out a series of violent acts that tragically ended the lives of at least 6 women in the Mollala Forest region of Oregon. These victims, primarily young women involved in the sex industry, were enticed by promises of money or job opportunities, only to be subjected to unimaginable horrors. Rogers' heinous crimes sent shockwaves across the nation, leaving behind a path of destruction. Families grieved the loss of their loved ones, while communities struggled to come to terms with the sheer horror of his actions. In order to avoid capture and cause unspeakable horror to his victims, Dayton Leroy Rogers used a predatory and deliberate approach to his crimes as part of his serial killer methodology. Rogers carefully considered his options before making his attacks, picking out weaker women as his targets and covering his tracks to stay under the radar. The victims that Rogers chose to focus on was a key component of his methodology. These were women who were marginalized and frequently engaged in sex work or experiencing addiction. He would pretend to be offering help or companionship in order to entice them into remote locations, like the Oregon Mollala Forest. After being left alone, Rogers would give in to his violent tendencies, overwhelming his victims with brute force and torturing them in ways that were beyond comprehension. Rogers' skill at tricking and manipulating his victims, taking advantage of their trust and vulnerability to further his crimes, was a key component of his methodology. Often using charm and cunning to win them over, he would then quickly turn predatory, establishing his dominance and creating fear to thwart any resistance. Furthermore, Rogers' tactic went beyond the actual murder, as he used a variety of strategies to hide from authorities and destroy evidence. He would take great care to hide his victims' bodies in isolated areas, making it challenging for law enforcement to find evidence of his crimes. To further impede efforts to find him, Rogers would frequently assume aliases and alter his appearance in order to evade detection. Law enforcement officials found their investigation into Dayton Leroy Rogers' crimes to be a difficult and drawn-out process. Due to Rogers' guile and capacity for evasion, the investigation team faced many challenges in trying to piece together the evidence and identify a suspect. But eventually, significant advancements were made thanks to the hard work of the police and the cooperation of several agencies, which resulted in Rogers' eventual capture and prosecution. After years of terror and uncertainty in the community, Dayton Leroy Rogers' reign of terror came to an abrupt end in 1987, when he was finally apprehended by law enforcement. Rogers was apprehended as a consequence of hard-working law enforcement, cooperation amongst various agencies, and a fortunate break that finally brought him down. Authorities in Oregon launched a massive manhunt to find the elusive killer responsible for a string of brutal murders. in the Mollala forest area. The investigation was notable for its intricacy and the enormity of the task involved, as law enforcement agents hurried to apprehend Rogers prior to him trying to exploit additional victims. The case took a significant turn when a witness saw Rogers close to one of the crime scenes. This information gave investigators a critical lead that eventually resulted in Rogers' capture. Based on this information, law enforcement agencies moved quickly to arrest Rogers, sending teams of officers to search the area and find the elusive murderer. Dayton Leroy Rogers was ultimately found and taken into custody by police after a protracted search, ending his reign of terror and offering some comfort to the families of his victims. The legal process that would ultimately decide his fate began when he was taken into custody and accused of several counts of murder. Deep questions concerning the essence of evil and the extent of human depravity are brought up by the Dayton Leroy Rogers case. Psychologists have looked into the things that caused Rogers to go down the path of violence and devastation in an effort to understand his twisted psyche. His legacy is one of trauma and terror, which has a long-lasting effect on Oregon's community and the global community. His crime scars are still visible today, acting as a sobering reminder of the darkness that permeates human souls. We are left feeling horrified and incredulous at the brutality Dayton Leroy Rogers committed as we come to the end of our investigation into his life and crimes. His tale serves as a disheartening reminder of everyone's potential for evil, and the necessity of quality assurance is defined to prevent acts of violence and depravity from occurring among us.
If you found this video insightful, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel for more content on true crime and psychological analysis. Remember to stay vigilant, and until next time, stay safe.